students write grades or decide on grades, and then there's a comments column, just like a report card, that a student might bring home from school with comments by the teacher, except we're the teacher. And so again, this organizes in a very simple visual way on the whiteboard the issues that the company is facing and where it's falling short in terms of performance, which in this case is in almost every area. And I actually hand out copies of a blank report card as well, so that students don't have to be scribbling things down. And I'm very big on, students should be paying attention in class, not scribbling, having to scribble this down. If they're trying to write all of this down, they're not paying attention in class, so they then have a vehicle that makes it relatively easy to do that. So this is a very simple whiteboard plan. And I actually start off teaching the case with this, and then I go to something considerably more complicated. So in this case, this is what's called a stakeholder preference matrix, and what I do is have students break up into groups and represent different stakeholders. And in the case, there are a number of different options that are presented for the water board, and different policy options here that they could use. I have each group represent a particular stakeholder. Stakeholders are arrayed across here. And I have the students break up into groups and say, okay, well, each of these options, would you like this option to be adopted? Give that a score of +3. Would you really be extremely hostile to this being adopted, a -3. And then I have them come up and write it on the board. And we then have, for each option, an array of stakeholder preferences and say, well, can we do this? Well, a company that might want to buy this company would really love this option, +3. But the World Bank, which is going to have to finance it, would hate that option, okay? And so it's not going to work. So having all those stakeholder positions arrayed in a visible way, helps you think about, okay, would this option work? No, okay, that option wouldn't work. Should we consider other options? Are there ways that we could convince somehow the stakeholders, if we modified this option to make it more acceptable? So again, it's a way of visually displaying information in a way that I think helps the classroom discussion, that otherwise, sort of diffuse ideas about, no, this would work, this wouldn't work, here it all becomes very clear. Okay, so a question is, should you sketch out your whiteboard plan before class? So do I put this whole matrix on the board beforehand? And so there are advantages and disadvantages of putting your whiteboard plan. So, you want at least the illusion that students are sharing control of the classroom with the professor. And obviously, if you have the whiteboard plan up there beforehand, it's like, okay, I'm really telling you which way this discussion is going, how we're going to organize it. So it certainly lessens that kind of perception of shared control. And I think particularly if you're teaching executive education students who, may be thinking, oh, I know more than you do, that may be particularly an issue, that they may say, we should be running the discussion, not you running the discussion. I think, so I don't worry too much about that. So, if you're in my classroom, you're in my classroom, and I respect what you have to do, but I'm responsible for organizing things. The more serious problem, I would argue, is the third one I have listed up here is, well, suppose somebody makes a great comment, but it doesn't fit very neatly into the scheme that you've organized. Does that mean that you ignore it? Well, certainly you shouldn't ignore it. I always try to have a category called other in my whiteboard plans, and I tell the students in advance, here's the way I think things should be organized, but I know you're going to come up with great ideas, so if it doesn't fit very well, we'll put it under other and we won't marginalize it, okay? So that's one way to try to get around it, but clearly that's a risk. But in my point of view, and again, different instructors in different classes and even different cases, you may follow another strategy, but I sort of lean the direction of much of the time, not all of the time, of having a whiteboard plan up in advance. I think it helps to sort of guide the discussion, keep the discussion on track. Sometimes, when you're teaching, a student makes a comment that's kind of off base, or a couple of people make comments that kind of lead you away from where you're going, and you might kind of lose track of where you are and say, whoa, where am I going and how did I get here? And having the whiteboard plan up there, can help you to get back on track. You can say, okay, interesting comment, but let's think about this point up here. So with the Kotanaka case, we've seen he's got problem X, and we haven't come up with any solutions to address problem X that Kotanaka is facing. So that can help you sort of get you back on track to where you want the discussion to go. So really it can be a crutch for the instructor, and as an instructor, there are often times I like to have crutches. Another reason that I do it is if you are sketching the whiteboard plan during the class, what is the class seeing? They're seeing your back, okay? So this helps to minimize back time. And also minimizes, I talked about juggling chainsaws, that's what case method teaching is. You're trying to do many different things at once. If you've got your whiteboard plan up there in advance, that's one less thing you have to juggle while you're keeping the discussion going. So again, don't do it all the time. Think about what's comfortable for you, but it generally works for me, especially since, as you all have seen, I'm a terrible writer on whiteboards, and so if I'm trying to do all these things and write on the whiteboard at the same time, my scribbling gets even more illegible. So having it up there in advance, I can be somewhat neater, hopefully, although still suboptimally so. Any thoughts about whiteboard plans? Yeah, you good? Okay, so let's talk about limiting distractions from students. Any of you ever walk around a classroom or walk into a colleague's classroom and note that all these eager students have their laptops open and they're on Facebook? You of course think that they are, when it's in your class, that they are, taking notes, but I hate to tell you, having visited some of my colleagues' classrooms, that's not what they're doing, They're on Facebook or they're doing something else. So how do you deal with this? Well, I'll tell you what I do. Not necessarily what you should do, but this is my solution. So this is what I show students the very first class of the semester. I say, think of it as you're getting on an airplane and you're about to take off, and what they tell you is, please turn off all electronic devices. And I then show them this sign, which I got off the internet, saying, dear students, I know when you're texting in class, seriously, no one just looks down at their crotch and smiles. And so, and you all know this, right? In your classrooms, you've seen students, looking down below their desk and smiling and, going like this. You can't see exactly what they're doing, but, their fingers are down there. There are only a couple of things you could be doing, and you kind of hope that what they're doing is, playing with their electronic device. So, I show them the sign. I say, yes, I can see you texting, and it will be reflected in your participation grade. And then, because, they don't see from your perspective, they think that it's invisible when they've got their devices down there below the desk, and, let them look from the professor's perspective and see, no, I can tell. I really can tell. I can tell all the time. And I say, if you need to see, read, and respond to a text message immediately, there's some sort of family emergency or something like that, let me know before class. But, do you really need to do that? I don't think so. And I say, why this rule? Well, everybody says, I can multitask. I'm a good multitasker. And I say, I believe that you are a good multitasker. I believe that you can pay full attention and be texting at the same time. But research suggests that none of your classmates can do that. You are the only one. And I can't make an exception for you. I have to have the same rule for everybody. And as a result, even though I trust you to be able to do that, sorry, we're going to have the same rule for everybody. So all electronic devices off. And people say, well, all my readings are on my tablet. And I say, well, sorry. In my class, yes, you do need to print out the readings, or you need to take careful notes on them. And then, if you were worried about being ecological, recycle those notes. Although for my class, of course, the notes are so important that you really do want to save them for posterity and pass them on to your children and grandchildren. But, if you don't want to do that, go ahead and recycle them. And so they may say, well, there may be something that comes up in class where, we need to look up something on Google, to check on a fact or something like that. How do you deal with that problem? Well, you can have a designated Googler. Say, one person can have their tablet open off to the side, and if we really do need to look something up, the designated Googler will look it up for us, but the rest of us will not be distracted, okay? So again, I don't know if that strategy works for you. It does work for me as a way to limit the endless distractions that students have, which I think are particularly destructive for a case-oriented class, because you really need people to be engaged, and people, in terms of peer effects, need to see that everyone else is fully engaged, that there really needs to be that sort of signal that's being sent. Anybody else try different strategies or have different ideas for limiting student distraction? Yeah.
I find it really hard to do that because it's like you have a group of executives and they are all these adults who are so responsible and important, and then you are like telling them to close their laptops, and then you usually get escalation saying like, who are you to tell me what to do right now?
Yeah.
And I wonder if you ever get this kind of reaction, or is it just like young and inexperienced people like me who are...
No. So I think it is more of an issue with executive education. So this was the question, if people can hear. Is it particularly an issue in executive education? I think the answer is yes. And I do tend to go easier on the executives. I say, I really would appreciate it if you would turn off your electronic devices, and most people do, or at least sort of put them off to the side in executive ed classes. Some don't, and I put up with it much more for executive ed classes than I do with. I teach mostly master's students, and I'm pretty strict with the master's students. I say, turn it off. So I took a workshop on case teaching at Harvard Business School, and the professor there said that what he does in classes is he tells people on the first day, if your phone goes off during class, I will answer it. And so he goes, usually the first couple days it happens. The phone goes off, he goes over, says, this is Professor so-and-so, he's in class right now, could you please call back in about 45 minutes when we're out of class? And he said that he usually only has to do that once. And it's so embarrassing to the student that tends to take care of the problem. So, again, a variety of different strategies you can use. Yeah?
I know that at IMD they have lockers, and before even executives go into class, they put their gadgets into the locker. Well, at least this is what professors of IMD are saying. So.
Yeah, no, if you can get students to get in the habit of putting their electronic devices into lockers and have the norm established that you don't even take it to class, I think that that's a great idea. That's a hard norm to establish, and especially in larger universities where people are moving around a lot between buildings, they don't go to their locker. But just saying, turn it off is something that I have found I can make work. Okay, any other thoughts on limiting student distractions? Okay, so let's actually get into the classroom, and how do we, actually, sorry. Okay, how do we actually get a classroom started? So you can think of two basic kinds of openings. One I would call professor-led, and the other I would call student-led. So a professor-led opening would be something where the professor doesn't just come in like Jan Rivkin in the Holland-Sweetener case that we saw, and say, ask a question and zoom, it goes right to the students, where the professor talks for a few minutes. And there's certainly reasons why you might want to do this. You might want to talk about where the case fits into the progression of the course. Sometimes, as I said, you want to talk longer about the underlying theoretical concepts that lead into the case. As I said, in some of the classes I teach, it's about half lecture and about half case. The first half is introducing the theoretical concepts, and then the second half we're discussing a case. Or another way to do it is what I'm going to be doing today. One class is all lecture, and then the next class is all case. You can, there are lots of different ways you can do this depending on the kind of material, depending on the particular material that you're addressing and how much background you think the students need before they can really make maximum use of the case. If you decide you would have a student-led discussion-centered opening, well, what are some of the things that you can do there? You can ask somebody to open with the essential facts of the case and have them go on for several minutes. This is the way law schools often do it, where the professor kind of grills the student on the facts of the case, and again, it can go on for 5 minutes or more. I generally don't do that. Some people do it. I find that students don't want to listen to another student for a really extended period of time, that it's hard for them to get used to the idea that the student might have enough knowledge that I should actually listen to them for 5 minutes straight. And also, there's the risk that if they sort of go off in a wrong direction, that it would lead the class off, and then you're going to have to get them back. So I tend to, ask for something a little briefer, maybe a minute or two in advance. But again, it all depends on you. Another strategy that you can use is say, okay, tell me one critical fact about the case, or one, critical, analytical issue that you see in this case, and just go around and choose, 2 to 5 people to do that, and then you can list them on the board if you want to do that. You can do that. You can list some options for the class. If you want to start off, going right to the decision dilemma that's faced in the case, and ask people to vote on them, and then ask people to defend their vote. So, say, how many think A? How many think B? Okay, so you said A, tell me why you said A, and then choose somebody who said B, tell me why you said B. So that can be a really invigorating way to start off the discussion. If you want to lay a little more analytical background, you can just say, what are the major challenges that the protagonist faces in this case, and how do you go about addressing those, or ask who the most important stakeholders are in the case. And I would say, never do just one of these things all the time. Shift around among different strategies so that keeps the sort of classroom fresh and fit it to your case. In some cases, the stakeholder conflict is sort of a central feature of the case, and so starting off with who are the major stakeholders is a way to do it. In some cases, the kinds of options are clear, and but which one you should choose isn't so clear, and so that would be a case where you might want to start off with a class vote and then having people defend their points of view. So the starting question. How do you start off the class? If you're starting off in a discussion-centered way with a question, what should that question do? Well, it should reveal something about the central issues of the case. Again, it'd be something that immediately engages a large number of students, not something that they will see as being, kind of boring. There's usually a lot of energy coming into the class. Hopefully people are excited about the case, and you want to build on that if you can.
What would be boring?
What would be boring? Could be something that, if it's, well, tell me about this agency that, Mr. So-and-so is working in. If, in some cases you might want to do that, but oftentimes it will be something that they may not see as central to the case that you might want to bring in a little bit later, introduce the dilemma first, and that the decision makers facing, and then, in talking about constraints, you might want to say, well, what about this agency that he's working in, and how does that constrain the kinds of actions that he does? So, again, it depends on the case, but probably the, bringing the central dilemma up first and then going into some of the background of the constraints would be a more engaging way to frame it. Okay, and usually your opening question should be signaled in your study question. So, particularly for those of you, more than half of my students are not native English speakers in the main class that I teach, in the comparative policy process class. And a lot of them come from cultures where discussion is not something that is valued in the classroom. They are not used to it at all, and they are scared, and they feel extremely uncomfortable. So the more you can do to make them feel comfortable, the more likely they are to sort of buy into this concept of something that's very strange. So starting off with the study question where, with a question where if they look through the study questions, they should be able to have something to say, is a way of lessening the sort of discomfort that they're going to have, especially if you cold call, which is something I'm going to get to in just a second, in talking about student engagement. So how do you get student engaged in class? Well, let's start with before they come to class, right? What can you do so that when they get to class, they're more likely to be engaged? You can set up study groups to discuss the cases before class. So that's what we do in this LAD course. Before each case, you have a half an hour to meet and sort of discuss ideas. And again, I think this is particularly useful for students who are not working in their first language because they may not feel very comfortable about their own ideas, that they've really got the case. And so if they've tried out ideas, or maybe even are borrowing ideas from classmates in their study group that they can present in class, then they're more likely to feel comfortable. You know, you can invite email inquiries, you know, for people to write in beforehand and say, you know, I don't understand this fact, can you explain this to me? Online discussion boards are something that some people use. I have used them a few times. For myself, I have not found them very useful, particularly where, you know, you have to make at least one comment before every class on the discussion board. I've found that they tend to be very perfunctory and, you know, not very interesting. Some people make them work. A pre-class poll is something that you can do. So I sometimes set up doodle polls where I have them, you know, everybody has to vote before class on, you know, which option should you choose, or, and then I reveal the poll results at the beginning of class, or I do one where I talk about what are the objectives of these politicians, you know, and I list a bunch of different objectives, and they have to say, well, how important is re-election to this politician? How important is good policy? How important is a historical legacy? And then, you know, I get the poll results from the whole class, and I can tell them what the means are, and then say, you know, why do you think this is true? Why did most people think that, you know, politician X is mostly re-election oriented and politician Y is more good policy oriented? And then, you know, a last thing you can do before class is to set up the high expectations, create incentives. So it depends on the grading system that your university uses. My university leaves it up to me, and I have about 20% of the grade is based on participation. At Harvard Business School, it's 50%, so which really gives them a strong incentive to participate. Yeah.
If to return to how the pre-class poll, how do you check that it's not that students are not cheating? I mean, not picking up randomly the points. So how is the poll is organized? I mean.
Oh,
do you need just to make a checkbox, or you should write in the answer?
For the poll?
Pre-class poll, yeah.
The pre-class poll, I mean, I don't care what they say. I mean, it's usually kind of factual or their opinion about, you know, a particular strategic choice, yes or no. And in that, I don't, you know, give them a participation grade for that. So it's just to, you know, as a tool for something to